Well, perhaps I can try to react to those comments within my own framework in a way which will maybe shed some light on this. Let's think again of a human child who has in his mind some schematism that determines the kind of language he can learn. Okay. And then, given experience, he very quickly knows the language of which this experience is a part or in which it is included. Now this is a normal act, that is, it's an act of normal intelligence, but it's a highly creative act. If a Martian were to look at this process of acquiring this vast and complicated and intricate system of knowledge on the basis of this ridiculously small quantity of data, he would think of it as an immense act of invention and creation. In fact, a Martian would, I think, consider it as much of an achievement as the invention of, let's say, any aspect of a physical theory on the basis of the data that was presented to the physicist. However, if this hypothetical Martian were then to observe that every normal human child immediately carries out this creative act and they all do it in the same way and without any difficulty, whereas it takes centuries of genius to slowly carry out the creative act of going from evidence to a scientific theory, then this Martian would, if he were rational, conclude that the structure of the knowledge that is acquired in the case of languages basically internal to the human mind, whereas the structure of physics is not, in so direct a way, internal to the human mind. Our minds are not constructed so that when we look at the phenomena of the world theoretical physics comes forth, and we write it down and produce it. That's not the way our minds are constructed. Nevertheless, I think there is a possible point of connection, and it might be useful to elaborate it, that is, how is it that we are able to construct any kind of scientific theory at all? How is it that, given a small amount of data, it's possible for various scientists, for various geniuses even, over a long period of time, to arrive at some kind of a theory, at least in some cases, that is more or less profound and more or less empirically adequate? This is a remarkable fact. And, in fact, if it were not the case that these scientists, including the geniuses, were beginning with a very narrow limitation on the class of possible scientific theories, if they didn't have built into their minds somehow an obviously unconscious specification of what is a possible scientific theory, then this inductive leap would certainly be quite impossible, just as if each child did not have built into his mind the concept of human language. In a very restricted way, then the inductive leap from data to knowledge of a language would be impossible. So even though the process of, let's say, deriving knowledge of physics from data is far more complex, far more difficult for an organism such as ours, far more drawn out in time, requiring intervention of genius, and so on and so forth, nevertheless in a certain sense the achievement of discovering physical science or biology, or whatever you like, is based on something rather similar to the achievement of the normal child in discovering the structure of his language, that is, it must be achieved on the basis of an initial limitation, an initial restriction on the class of possible theories. If you didn't begin by knowing that only certain things are possible theories, then no induction would be possible at all. You could go from data anywhere, in any direction. And the fact that science converges and progresses itself shows us that such initial limitations and structures exist. If we really want to develop a theory of scientific creation, or for that matter artistic creation, I think we have to focus attention precisely on that set of conditions that, on the one hand, delimits and restricts the scope of our possible knowledge, while at the same time permitting the inductive leap to complicated systems of knowledge on the basis of a small amount of data. That, it seems to me, would be the way to progress towards a theory of scientific creativity, or in fact towards any question of epistemology.
Well, in what Mr. Chomsky has just said there is something which seems to me to create a little difficulty. Perhaps I understood it badly. I believe that you have been talking about a limited number of possibilities in the order of a scientific theory. That is true, if you limit yourself to a fairly short period of time, whatever it may be. But if you consider a longer period, it seems to me that what is striking is the proliferation of possibilities by divergences. For a long time the idea has existed that the sciences, knowledge, followed a certain line of progress, obeying the principle of growth, and the principle of the convergence of all these kinds of knowledge. And yet when one sees how the European understanding, which turned out to be a worldwide and universal understanding in the historical and geographical sense, developed, can one say that there has been growth? I, myself, would say that it has been much more a matter of transformation. Take, as an example, animal and plant classifications. How often have they not been rewritten, since the Middle Ages according to completely different rules, by symbolism, by natural history, by comparative anatomy, by the theory of evolution? Each time this rewriting makes the knowledge completely different in its functions, in its economy, in its internal relations. You have there a principle of divergence, much more than one of growth. I would much rather say that there are many different ways of making possible simultaneously a few types of knowledge. There is, therefore, from a certain point of view, always an excess of data in relation to possible systems in a given period, which causes them to be experienced within their boundaries, even in their deficiency, which means that one fails to realize their creativity, and from another point of view, that of the historian, there is an excess, a proliferation of systems for a small amount of data, from which originates the widespread idea that it is the discovery of new facts which determines movement in the history of science.
Here perhaps again, let me try to synthesize a bit. I agree with your conception of scientific progress, that is, I don't think that scientific progress is simply a matter of the accumulated addition of new knowledge and the absorption of new theories and so on. Rather I think that it has this sort of jagged pattern that you describe, forgetting certain problems, and leaping to new theories.
And transforming the same knowledge.
Right. But I think that one can perhaps hazard an explanation for that. Oversimplifying grossly, I really don't mean what I'm going to say now literally. One might suppose that the following general lines of an explanation are accurate. It is as if, as human beings of a particular biologically given organization, we have in our heads, to start with, a certain set of possible intellectual structures, possible sciences. Okay? Now, in the lucky event that some aspect of reality happens to have the character of one of these structures in our mind, then we have a science, that is to say that, fortunately, the structure of our mind and the structure of some aspect of reality coincide sufficiently, so that we develop an intelligible science. It is precisely this initial limitation in our minds to a certain kind of possible science which provides the tremendous richness and creativity of scientific knowledge. It is important to stress, and this has to do with your point about limitation and freedom, that were it not for these limitations, we would not have the creative act of going from a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of experience, to a rich and highly articulated and complicated array of knowledge. Because if anything could be possible, then nothing would be possible. But it is precisely because of this property of our minds, which in detail we don't understand, but which, I think, in a general way we can begin to perceive, which presents us with certain possible intelligible structures, and which in the course of history and insight and experience begin to come into focus, or fall out of focus and so on, it is precisely because of this property of our minds, that the progress of science, I think, has this erratic and jagged character that you describe. That doesn't mean that everything is ultimately going to fall within the domain of science. Personally, I believe that many of the things we would like to understand, and maybe the things we would most like to understand, such as the nature of man, or the nature of a decent society, or lots of other things, might really fall outside the scope of possible human science.
It is not a matter of combination. Only creativity is possible in putting into play of a system of rules. It is not a mixture of order and freedom. Where perhaps I don't completely agree with Mr. Chomsky, is when he places the principle of these regularities, in a way, in the interior of the mind, or of human nature. If it is a matter of whether these rules are effectively put to work by the human mind, all right too. If it is a question of whether the historian and the linguist can think it in their turn, it is all right also to say that these rules should allow us to realize what is said, or thought by these individuals. But to say that these regularities are connected, as conditions of existence, to the human mind or its nature, is difficult for me to accept. It seems to me that one must, before reaching that point, and in any case I am talking only about the understanding, replace it in the field of other human practices, such as economics, technology, politics, sociology, which can serve them as conditions of formation, of models, of place, of apparition, etc. I would like to know whether one cannot discover the system of regularity, of constraint, which makes science possible, somewhere else, even outside the human mind, in social forms, in the relations of production, in the class struggles, etc. For example, the fact that at a certain time madness became an object for scientific study, and an object of knowledge in the West, seems to me to be linked to a particular economic and social situation. Perhaps the point of difference between Mr. Chomsky and myself is that when he speaks of science he probably thinks of the formal organization of knowledge, whereas I am speaking of knowledge itself. That is to say, I think of the content of various knowledges which is dispersed into a particular society, permeates through that society, and asserts itself as the foundation for education, for theories, for practices, etc. You ask, but what does this theory of knowledge mean for your theme of the death of man or the end of the period of the 19th-20th centuries? My answer to that is, this question doesn't have any relation to what we're talking about.